All righty. So let's, just for a moment, let's recap. We won't recap the secular ones that we looked at and what the ethical systems that people hold to, just the Christian ones that people hold to. And I went ahead and wrote down some already. Save time. Unqualified absolutism, the first one. Unqualified absolutism, this view is probably one of the most held by Christians. The basic premise of this is that all moral conflicts are only apparent, they are not real. In other words, moral absolutists never come into conflict with one another, or moral absolutes, rather, never come into conflict with one another. Let me give you an example. It's morally wrong to lie, even if a life could be saved. Remember how we were discussing that? Now, a moral conflict could be, would be, it's wrong to lie, but I need to in order to save that person's life. I mean, we talked about like the Nazis and such, where, are we allowed to do that? We've talked a little bit about Rahab and such. So the unqualified absolutists say all moral conflicts are only apparent. You never break any of those moral standards. So then the conflicting absolutist comes along and says, hey, we've got a problem here because it appears that there are conflicts in morals. And what do we do about that? So they have to resolve the problem of absolute obligations coming into unavoidable conflict. So conflicting absolutists are convinced that there are moral absolute conflicts, and since the world is fallen, there will be moral dilemmas. Therefore, just pick the lesser of the two evils. Never kind of something we discussed was when we go to vote, right? Who do we pick? And what do you hear people say? I got to pick the lesser evil. So that's what the conflicting absolutists say. Say, look, you live in a fallen world, so there's going to be moral conflicts. Therefore, you've got to pick the lesser one. And they say, well, I'm going to sin still if I pick the lesser one. And they say, that's okay. God will forgive you. All right? So that's the conflicting absolutists. Now we move to the last one called graded absolutism. Of the three forms of absolutism held by Christians, unqualified absolutism, the first one we looked at, is typically associated with the Anabaptists. All right? The conflicting absolutist is typically associated with like the Lutherans. And then the graded absolutists, typically the Reformed. So let's look at this, at the essential elements of graded absolutism. Number one is this. And I'm going to have to write this out because I didn't write it. Number one is this, something that they would say. There are higher and lower moral laws. What'd I do? Oh, I already wrote it. Lord have mercy. Did you get it the first time? Or did you need it the second time? Yeah. Let's do this. I only put it down once. Okay. It'll be interesting. Okay. So, not all moral laws are of equal weight. That's what that means. There are higher and lower moral laws. Remember, the conflicting absolutists say, hey, two moral laws are going to conflict, and you're going to have to do the one, you have to pick one, and by doing so, you're going to break the other one, therefore you're going to sin, no matter what. Well, the graded absolutists say, you know what? Wait a minute. There are higher and lower moral laws. Not all moral laws are of the same weight. They're not of the same value. Let me give you an example. If you like, Matthew 23, verse 23, if you'd like to turn there. Because I'm writing, we won't be able to put those on the screen. So Matthew 23, verse 23. I want to give you a set of scriptures that the graded absolutist holds to and utilizes to help make their point and define the definition here of what a graded absolutist is. So Matthew 23, verse 23 says this, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others." Notice the word weightier. Jesus is putting a value here. He's putting a level. How about Matthew chapter 5? Jump back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 19. Matthew 5, verse 19 says this, "Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." Notice the word least here, recognizing a value. How about Matthew 22, verse 36? This one right here stands out pretty loud to me. Matthew 22, verse 36. I hear pages and I hear people clicking their phone, you know. It's kind of funny. Matthew 22, verse 36. "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Isn't that something? Which is the greatest? The one who asked this question was recognizing a value system in God's law. He just wants to know the greatest. He didn't want to know the least. He wanted to know the greatest. Take a look at John chapter 19, verse 11. John 19, verse 11. This is a really good one right here, I think. John 19, verse 11. Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Isn't that something? Value set. There's a level here. Let me give you another one. One more. Matthew 5:22. Matthew 5:22. This is another great one right here. And tell me if you see three levels here, okay? Three levels. Matthew 5:22. "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell." Three levels. Which, a side note here, "you fool" in the original language is the word moronic, right? Where we get our word moron. And it's interesting that God goes to this extent that if we call a person a moron, how God sees that is we are defaming that person. In other words, we are trying to take away, steal what they are in the image of God. And when we try to take away and steal what a person is in the image of God, God sees that as like disastrous. So really, this word should say moron, but fool, moron, you know, there is similar, I guess. So, what's that? Yeah.
Was it a heavier insult back then?
Yeah. I think it was a heavy insult back then. Yeah, it was. A moron would be taking a person and saying they are less of what they are. And God really takes that pretty heavy, you know. Yeah. Because, you know, we use the word fool. It's okay to say foolish, right? Because, you know, wisdom is the correct use of knowledge. So if a person isn't using the knowledge that, you know, let's say, for example, you told somebody something and they decided to do the exact opposite, right? That happens sometimes. Well, then they are foolish because they had the knowledge to do something right. So to say to someone, you know, you're behaving foolishly, you're very foolish in what you're saying is not what God is speaking of here. What God is speaking of here is stealing, taking away, tearing apart, if you will, a person's who they are in the image of God. That's what God takes very seriously. So that's why when you say fool, I think of foolish, but really it's moron. Okay, so Jesus indicates 3 levels of sin with corresponding judgments. Isn't that something? 3 levels of sin. So it appears that all sins are not created equal, that there are higher and lower laws. Now, we know this from the position of consequence, right? Not every sin has the same consequence. They have different consequences. If you are driving down the road and somebody cuts you off and you scream at them, I mean, that's between you and God, right? You're screaming, I mean, you're really yelling, you're calling them a moron, right? That's between you and God. And there's a consequence there between you and God. But let's say that you decided to go and pit this person, drive up behind them and take out their back end to cause them to spin out, because you're the same anger is there, but you did something differently. There's a different consequence. And what the greatest absolutist would say, there's different levels here. If you do something like that in the car and you do something like this outside, the consequences are different. The consequences likely show the differences of the levels of the sin that are being committed here. So, number 2. Here's number 2. And if you have any questions, let me know. I didn't write this one. There are unavoidable moral conflicts. Okay, there are unavoidable moral conflicts. For example, God wants us to obey the laws of the land, right? He wants us to obey the law. But when Pharaoh told the Hebrew midwives to notify him about male infants, what did they end up doing? They didn't. They didn't do that. And God was fine with it, right? God was okay with that. He didn't have a problem with that. He wants us to obey the laws of the land, but the Pharaoh was going to kill the kids, so they didn't do it. God was okay. How about the Jewish captives when they disregarded Nebuchadnezzar to bow down before the golden image? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Here's all these people outside. Nebuchadnezzar had the whole city of Babylon come out, this humongous gold statue, and he yells and tells them all to bow down and worship, and everybody bows down, and one of his officials looks up, and there's 3 guys standing. They said, we're not going to do it. He said, well, I'll kill you. We're not doing it. But that's the law of the land. So there are unavoidable moral conflicts, no doubt. God wants us to obey the laws of the land, but what happens when they conflict with God? What do you think? If a law of the land conflicts with God's law, what are we supposed to do? Because there's a conflict there. What do we do? We obey God. Yeah. So the unqualified absolutist would say there's no such thing as a moral conflict there. Okay. That if we are to obey the laws of the land, then it won't conflict with God's law. But we know it to conflict with God's law, right? The conflicting absolutist says, hey, I know that there's a problem, so go ahead and obey God's law and ask for forgiveness for not obeying the human law. See, they would say that there's a conflict, but you just have to be forgiven for this one. Well, the graded absolutist says, hey, there are lower and lower levels of God's law, and God's law of obeying the law of the land is here, but God's law of obeying Him is here. So if you obey this one and not this one, you're not sinning. You're just obeying the higher of the law. Makes sense, doesn't it? Okay, Romans chapter 13. Romans 13. What's it? Oh yeah. Romans 13, verse 1 through 3. Yeah. Let's read that. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. And that's Apostle Paul speaking to the church in Rome. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise the same. I don't know, maybe these verses need to be on our TV instead of some other things. But if you look at this, generally speaking, what Paul is saying is to obey what the Roman emperor has laid down, what he has written in law. I mean, can you imagine him telling Christians to obey Emperor Nero, one of the most deadliest emperors of them all? But that's what he's telling them. Obey the laws of the land. 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter 2, verse 13 and 14. Oh, okay. Okay, no problem. 1 Peter 2, verse 13 and 14. Yeah. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and praise of those who do right. But we're to obey God when human laws conflict with God's law, though, right? So here we have some absolutes here out of Romans and Peter. Absolute. Obey the laws of the land. But is there any time that we don't have to obey those laws? You remember Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5, verse 29. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. These guys, Peter and some of the other apostles were told, you're not allowed to preach anymore. You're not allowed to talk about Jesus. You're not allowed to tell people about Jesus. And Peter said, wait a second here. Am I to obey you or God? When God's the one that told us to go out and tell people about Jesus. And they would say, you obey us. And Peter says, we're not doing that. We're obeying God. So it appears that Peter recognized a higher and a lower moral standard here. Unlike the conflicting absolutists, by Peter disregarding the law of the land, he was not violating, he was not committing a sin. He was just picking the higher law, which said to obey God. Isn't that? Now, do we have any laws in our land today that violate God's law? Do we? What's that? Well, but it's not law, though. I mean, is there a law that says that we have to do something that is contrary to God's law? We actually have really good laws in this land. Okay, what does Canada have? You'll be charged if you counsel someone who is gender dysphoria. If you counsel them, you will be, We have states that have done that, I think, if I recall. Yeah.
They call it anti-Semitism.
Oh.
That term, I think
Yeah.
not anti-Semitism.
Yes.
So that's, I think, again, it's in our force
Yeah.
saying you're not allowed to talk like that.
Yeah, those types of laws can end up to the negative, can't they? Yeah, I agree. Yes.
They had those cases where they bakers to make those cakes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, yes.
I think laws that can be mislabeled and misleading, like equal rights, like Lincoln's just talking about. And a question I have perhaps is, would it be called a law if it's a law that allows? Let's just pick Minnesota right now, great topic. Let's just say this is a law, they allow for a child, a certain age, leave their parents, get on an airplane, get paid funds for the transfer, go to Minnesota and get involved in gender or you're changing their gender. Now, is a law something that just simply imposes a punishment? Or is a law that allows? I think there's two different categories. Yeah, they allow evil, and when we read 13:1 and others, I've got a whole list of them here, different Bible verses. It goes down further, it says, rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. You want to be afraid of the authority, do what is good, and so there are bad laws, I believe, but let's say there's good ones. Simple one be, it's right to follow a speed limit, 75, 55. That's a good law. If you break it, I can see law or forced to follow the law to make a wedding cake for someone I don't. That's a bad.
I think there's some arguments against it,
Yeah.
but I hear you. Yeah. No, I totally get what you're saying. Bill, I mean, from their perspective. Yes. Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. So did in America's rebellion and revolution against the British, was that a sin? Yeah. Yeah. And it makes you think, right? It makes you ask the question, what were they trying to do? Or did they come over to the land? They were separating themselves, and the king assumed control where he shouldn't have assumed control. I don't know. I think there's a lot. It's curious, isn't it? Yes. Thank you.
But his benefit, a few years ago, law still on the books in Portland, Oregon, where it's against the law to whistle underwater. Not against God's law. His logic, maybe, but it's a law on the books. So don't do that.
Thank you. Oh my. Number 3. No guilt is imputed for the unavoidable. Okay, that's what we've been kind of talking about here. God does not hold a person responsible for personally avoiding moral conflicts, providing that person keeps the higher law. That's the big deal here. What is the higher law? Keep it. For example, a husband promises to meet his wife at 6 o'clock for dinner. I promise you, I will be there. Nothing will take me away. But he's delayed because he's saving a life. He couldn't fulfill the promise because a higher moral law of saving that life was in play here. He couldn't fulfill the promise because of the higher law exercised. Was he sinning? He made a promise. Now, right? According to graded absolutists, he took the higher law. The prophet Daniel. Remember the prophet Daniel was told, you're not allowed to pray to your God anymore. You remember what Daniel did? He went into his room and he prayed. Right? And his working partners, they were scoping him out. And they said, yep, there he is. He's praying. He's doing it again. So they ran to the king. Did he sin? So an unqualified absolutist would say he sinned. A conflicting absolutist say he sinned. He needs to ask for forgiveness, but it's okay that he sinned because he picked the right one, the right moral law. And then the graded absolutist said, no, there's different levels here. He picked the higher, so he didn't sin at all. Yeah. David and his men who broke into the temple and stole the consecrated bread. In Matthew chapter 12, they were declared guiltless. I mean, that was a big no-no. And Jesus said, not a problem. Take a look at Luke chapter 2, please. Luke chapter 2, verse 41 and 42. Luke chapter 2, verse 41. It says, now his parents, Jesus' parents, went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. Do you remember what happened next? Jesus heads over to the temple. What's that? Parents lost him. He didn't tell them anything. So they worked their way home. And then jump down to verse 49 there. They worked their way home. And verse 49, and Jesus said to them, so when the parents finally found him, why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house? They were pretty upset. Where's our kid? We lost him. We're on our way home, and he's still in Jerusalem somewhere. They go into Jerusalem, and they realize he's at the temple teaching. Did Jesus sin? I mean, shouldn't he have stayed with his parents? 12 years old. He should have communicated with them. Yeah, we would say that the right thing to do would be communicate, right? Yes. Oh, big discrepancy between law and rules. Yeah. Well, think of it from a moral standpoint. That could be rules or laws. So from a biblical moral standpoint, he was to obey his parents. Right, now we're in a bad situation here. So did Jesus abide by graded absolutism? He picked the higher moral law and thereby didn't sin. So from this ethical standpoint, God exempts a person from his duty or her duty to keep the lower law, since that person could not keep it without breaking a higher law. So this exemption functions like an ethical right of way. Pick the higher law, and you're exempt from not doing the lower. What do you think about that? Yes.
Are we going to touch on that? That's something we're growing in. And
Well, in part 3 here, why don't we jump into part 3? Maybe we can discuss some of this. But do you see the graded absolutist point of view? Do you find that interesting? Is it persuading at all? Or would you disagree with that? Your unqualified absolute, let me ask you this, have you ever met anyone that will not go to war because if they killed someone, they believe, or Christian, if they kill someone, they would see it as murder. So that's the unqualified absolutists. That's what they hold to. But what happens if your country goes to war? What happens with David? How did David get around this? How did the people that he was with who were honoring God, how did they get around this? So we have to ask ourselves these questions. Just because we may think something is wrong, what does Scripture really say about it? Is it wrong? Yes.
So isn't the great taking, we flip that around?
No, I don't think so. So the way they look at it, so he asked the question, are they taking the lesser of the two evils? What they're saying is, and they're resting their whole theological stance on, is that, and that's why I read those verses at the beginning that they hold to, is that there are different levels. So you have to look at your situation and determine the highest level. If there's an apparent conflict, which they say there is no apparent conflict, but if you're in your brain, you're like, two moral standards here. Which one do I abide by? We'll pick the highest one. The law says, don't tell people about Jesus. Jesus says, go out and make disciples. Which one do I pick? So it's not the lesser, it's the higher. Well, I don't know, because see, the conflicting absolutists say that there are conflicts in moral standards. The graded absolutists said there are no conflicts. You just pick the higher. So that's how they're really different.
Violate-
Right. You're exempt.
You don't need to ask for
Right. Where the conflicting absolutists,
say,
you have to ask for forgiveness because you're actually committing a sin.
yeah, you all over the same way, asking for
Yes.
critical.
Yes. Yes.
Truly repentant.
Well, yes. That's why I have a problem with conflicting absolutism. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Part 3. Let's talk about, well, yes. Oh. Yeah.
I'm sorry, God, I don't know you.
Okay, you need to say that. I'm staying out of all this. I'm just presenting what they're saying. Go ahead, Tom. Tell them, say it out loud. Sharon didn't hear you.
I just said that if wife has spent all day hair done, restaurant, better be there.
At the restaurant at 6 o'clock. That's,
You have to live with her.
yeah, you have to live with her. So you take the higher at that moment, right?
Yeah, that would be the highest.
Yeah. So if there's any moral dilemmas on the way, it doesn't matter. Yeah. Yes. Perception plays a huge part there. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Every action that God is telling me, what anybody. Period. Morals against it, ethics against it, you can do anything you want. God has told me, I'm sure in my heart, the doubt, right to do, I better get to do it.
And the unqualified absolutists and the conflicting absolutists and the graded absolutists would agree with you. That's the problem. Yeah. Yeah, they would agree. Yeah.
illustration you brought up of Shadrach, Meshach,
Yes.
absolutely, we are not going to fall down.
Yes.
My brother-in-law went through that in Vietnam. I will.
Yeah.
Medical order.
Yep.
Something like
Yep.
that. Shadrach, Meshach. Lord, I will not.
Yes. Yes. Yep.
That's a good outcome.
Hey, obey the laws of the land or obey God. The graded absolutist said, hey, obey God first and you're not sinning. And if it doesn't conflict, if God's law doesn't conflict with man's law, then obey man's law. And Shadrach obeyed God's law over that. So, okay, you know what? Next week we'll finish this up. There's this last section called Christian Ethics. I kind of marked down Christian Ethics, where what I'd like to do with you, just take a few moments and look at just some particulars of basic Christian ethics. And then challenge you on some things, challenge myself on some things with those ethics and what we have discussed the past few weeks. I hope so far up to this point has been challenging, and we all fall into one of these categories. I can tell you that. We all fall into one of these categories, or we bounce from one category to the other based upon how we feel at the moment. But is that the right thing to do? It's not very ethical, is it? Not ethical. Okay. Any final questions before we close up completely? No? All right. Yes.
Waiting for the basic Christian. Because it seems like we're going to get more confused in what to decide on that with all the isms that are going around as opposed to absolute, unabsolute.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that's going to be a bigger conflict for Christianity than all the moral.
It really won't be. It helps. What I like to talk about was what helps us to solidify that there are absolutes. And as Christians, we have to recognize that we live in a climate today where absolutes are not there. They're not apparent. They're not absolute. Yes. We live in a very relative environment. But if we live in a relative environment, then what are the standards? And if your relative standards conflict with my relative standards, then who's right and who's wrong? Yes.
The absolute.
So we're going to talk a little bit about next week how God has written something on our hearts.
Okay.
Yeah. In that we typically abide by the same moral standards, but we have the ability to neglect those moral standards. But if we neglect those moral standards, who are we in conflict with? So those are some things we will talk about next week. So, okay, let me close up in prayer. Father, thank you for letting us walk through this lively, interesting topic. But ultimately, we understand that we do have an ethical, moral system. And though the system may fluctuate based on feelings or situation, we do have one. And you have one as well. What is yours? Help us to comply to your standard and not to our own standard that we have somehow created, manufactured. But what is on your heart, God? What is your desire? What is your leading as our shepherd? Cause us to see it, understand it, and not move away from it. May feelings never dictate our stand with you, in you. May you be the one that we glorify, not self. Help us with it. In Jesus' name, amen.